versus transformation. The two images here kind of, for me, capture to some extent, and in the case of any metaphor, I think, metaphors are always kind of a way of representing some ideas and concept, but never really kind of fully explain an idea or a concept. If I think of the leaves there in the picture at the bottom, they probably kind of offer a metaphor of change. The color of the leaf kind of changes, but ultimately the leaf is the leaf. It remains the same. We can still recognize the same shape. The color is different. The kind of autumnal shade that we see in the last one is some kind of change compared to the green, obviously, of summer, but ultimately is not significantly different. Whereas the butterfly, the cocoon, the caterpillar, and I had to actually look this up, they don't actually change their genetic makeup, but the shape is significantly different in this case. So there is a sense that transformation is a much deeper concept in terms of change. It really kind of brings about a shift. And while I heard, in the breakout room that some were talking more about personal change, an inward kind of process, this is not just the meaning of transformation. It's something, and this is really, I'm quoting from Caroline Clark, transformational learning shapes people in a way that they're different afterward in both ways than oneself. So there is that kind of personal dimension whereby we feel different. And whether the changes in identity, the changes in perspective, the changes in the way we act, all of those dimensions possibly are affected, but certainly the way we think, we will see it's the fundamental one. But it's also a way that others can recognize. So there is that kind of dual dimension. There is also an outward dimension whereby change is so significant that impacts on who we are, how we interact in our context, and how we think. Okay, so all of those aspects really are impacted when we think in terms of transformation. So that kind of degree of strength, but also significance for the individual and for the individual beyond his own personal context. Obviously, today we will be talking specifically from the perspective of Jack Mesereau. Jack Mesereau, I would imagine some of you might be familiar with, born in the US, and he had a degree in social sciences and then kind of doctorate in adult education. So it comes with that kind of understanding of adult education, and worked as an adult educator himself, and wrote for almost 30 years. And so some of the possibly the most significant publication are kind of just listed there. I'm not really going to go into any of the publication, but certainly one mention that I should make at this point is that there was a shift in his own thinking from the initial kind of first publication, an article published in 1978 on perspective transformation, to the later publication where he broadens the focus of his reflection and starts to consider some of the criticism. And we will discuss some of the criticism later on, but certainly one important criticism was that his own thinking, his own kind of theorization lacks the contextual element and the intersubjective element. So let's have a look a little bit at the influences on Paulo Freire. On Mesereau. And sorry, I kind of had Paulo Freire in front of me on the screen. Three possibly key influences really that we can refer to. John Dewey would be probably the first one that comes to mind for a number of reasons, not just in terms of reflection, reflective thinking, but also in relation to democratic education. John Dewey, considered probably the father of philosophy of education, contemporary philosophy of education, and two significant books really that kind of influence method of thinking. One is How We Think, which, if memory doesn't fail me, was published in 1908 or 1909, and then Democracy in Education, that I think was written approximately 10 years later. And in how we think, he very much kind of defines what thinking is, and in particular, he defines critical reflection, and it connects also the concept of reflection to experience, and ultimately makes the point that reflection is a structured way of thinking that is based on our experience and that informs our future action. So in order to progress with our thinking and with our reflection, we look back to look forward. And there is a process whereby we can make inferences based on our previous experience, and we can inform our future encounter with new experiences on the basis of what we encountered before. So that connection between past, present, and future experience through the lens of reflection and persistent, thoughtful reflection. Okay. And in terms of democracy, it tells us that education is a means to democratic action. Okay, he is also considered the father of experiential learning, but also democracy in his conception, it's an active process whereby we engage in meaningful experiences that elicit reflection and elicit development at both not only individual and personal level, but also social level. So education has two sides for Dewey, the social and the personal, and all important, not just, one particular dimension. So that kind of idea was particularly influential in terms of method theory, because its emphasis on thinking or rational thought is underpinning the concept of transformation. Freire also brings the idea of reflection and action. The whole idea of praxis is essentially thought in action, but also this idea of conscientizao, and I'm not a Portuguese speaker, so apologies for those who are, which is the idea of consciousness raising and awareness and raising kind of an ability to participate in society through an enhanced self-understanding, but an enhanced also access to resources through education. You're very familiar probably with the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, written in the 70s, also with the Pedagogy at OPE. And the idea is that personal reflection and consciousness awareness really brings about the possibility to participate actively in society. And all of this happens through a dialogical process. Freire advocates dialogue as the mean for raising consciousness and critical consciousness. And of course, education is very much at the center of this particular process that kind of enables individuals really to move forward, to actively engage in society. Habermas, also the sociologist Jürgen Habermas, also talks about dialogue and talks in particular of communicative action, which he counterpounds with the idea of instrumental action. And communicative action is a particular form of dialogical engagement that enables individuals to share meaning. And this is, again, a key concept in the theory of Mezirow, where we engage in reflective thought, we engage in a process of dialogical interaction with ourselves and with others as a means to become more able to recognize our blind spot and to move forward in our own kind of a personal development and possibly societal development. So we're talking about some concept derived from this particular author. One, it's meaning. Meaning is at the center of the enterprise of transformative education. Mezirow would say the meaning schemes and perspective transformation is the central process of adult development. And what we do in education, in any form of education, it's some idea of some sharing of meaning with our students. There is a process of negotiation if we're open enough really to allow our students really to actively participate in the process. And this leads to some co-construction of meaning. But in terms of transformative learning, what is particularly important that we look also at the deconstruction of existing meaning. This is really core to the idea of transformation, that before we move forward, we need to look back, and if you remember, we're talking about doing in this sense, and then we reconstruct meaning. So going back, deconstructing, and the educator as a particular role in helping learners to deconstruct existing meaning that could be potentially problematic and actually act as a barrier to moving forward and developing and transforming. In terms of the reflection, we said, from Dewey, we derived the whole idea of reflection and experience. And reflection, we said, is a means to critical awareness. And particularly when we look at experience and we look back at experience and we try to reflect on it as a way of moving forward. And ultimately, and this is the purpose really of transformative learning, according to Mezirow, is that to gain autonomy and autonomous thinking. And this is really what is fundamental in terms of transformation, that the transformation makes us change in a significant way, in such a way that leads us to be more autonomous and less prone to be swayed by others. So we are able to have that ability to read between the lines. And then, of course, dialogue is the other underpinning concept. And when we think of dialogue, really, there are some elements that are important. The difference is the first one. We wouldn't engage in dialogue with those who share our same view. So the idea of kind of dialogue is fundamental to reach an understanding, but we start from different positions. And we need really to arrive to a point where we can engage with others in a democratic fashion, and we can actually derive from that some improved judgment. And because we have also developed an ability for self-questioning, because ultimately with reflection, we start to really to look back at our experience and trying to dissect them to see what is the obstacle to further development. So we were mentioning transformative learning. The whole idea starts from an article published in the American Journal of Adult Education, and in 1978, and it was titled Perspective Transformation. So that kind of core that needs to change in order to move forward. And there are three elements to it: thinking, feeling, and acting. Mezirow has often been accused to focus more on the thinking and the emotional, and particularly the intersubjective dimension, possibly not as fully addressed as the cognitive dimension, that really kind of has to do with our own thinking. And acting, while should follow from thinking, wasn't initially a core dimension of Mezirow thinking. But let's see what Mezirow himself had to say about the purpose of transformative learning. A defining condition of being human is that we have to understand the meaning of our experience. For some, an uncritically assimilated explanation by an authoritative figure will suffice. But in contemporary society, we must learn to make our own interpretation rather than act on the purposes, beliefs, judgment, and feelings of others. And this is really fundamental because we are vulnerable if we depend on others' perspectives. If we develop our own, we know what our perspective is, and we're able to express a critical yet constructive opinion. We're able really to participate in society in a more active fashion. Facilitating such understanding is the cardinal goal of adult education. And autonomous thinking is the cardinal goal of transformative learning. So it's a form of empowerment, ultimately. And here again, it resonates with Paulo Freire. And if you're familiar with Paulo Freire, his own thinking kind of really was contextualized in terms of rural Brazil and poor peasants not having access to education and being left to the margin and being, as a result of that, vulnerable. And of course, that context could be transferred in many other contexts. And here I suppose I'm using a riddle that Mather uses himself, just really kind of as a starting point for unpacking the whole idea of transformative learning. He doesn't think there is anything the matter with him, because one of the things that is the matter with him is that he doesn't think that there is anything the matter with him. Therefore, we have to help him realize that the fact that he doesn't think that there is anything the matter with him is one of the things that is the matter with him. And what does that mean? Obviously, the blind spot that sometimes all we have, but particularly, if our way of thinking hasn't been broadened, we might be particularly unaware of those blind spots. And we all have blind spots, but certainly if we think in terms of adult education, our purpose is to help our students to broaden their mind, to participate actively in society, to have the tools to participate in society, but this broadening of perspective and highlighting blind spots as a way of moving forward and developing its core in the discussion. So what is then transformative learning? So how do we define transformative learning? Learning might be understood as a process of using prior interpretation to construe a new or revised interpretation of the meanings of one's experience to guide future action. So remember, we were talking about Dewey and how Dewey made the point that reflective thought is making connection between experiences we encountered and being able to analyze them and then making connection with new experiences. So when we experience something, generally it becomes a repertoire, part of our repertoire of experience. Imagine if, if our own mind was like a wardrobe where we store all our clothes, or a chest of drawer where we store all our clothes. And every time that there is something new that we encounter, we try to put it in this particular storage. And we need to relate it in some ways to what is already in that particular storage. So let's say if our new experience was the equivalent of kind of item of clothing, we'd say, okay, now what we encounter now is the equivalent of a pair of socks, and that is my drawer for a pair of socks. So I kind of try to classify all my experiences in related fashion, okay? And if there is something new that we haven't experienced before, it becomes a new element in our repertoire of experiences that I need to kind of, in some way, kind of formalize in some form. But when we encounter experiences that are similar to previous one, we classify them in the same way. We tend to actually put them in the same category. And this is really what happens generally. So we look back at the experience, we classify, and then we move forward with that. And I won't have the chance really to show you this, but I've included, just purely for reference, a video where Stephen Brookfield, I know many of you might be familiar with the theory and the writings of Stephen Brookfield. And it's a video from Vimeo, so you might have to just sign in for this particular platform, but I think it's free kind of platform. And it's a discussion really of transformative learning. Brookfield was working actually directly with Jack Mather, so there is a very much he reports on his discussion with Jack Mather. So we were talking about, the three-dimension convictional, behavioral, and cognitive thinking, the emotional, but also the beliefs really that kind of constitute the dimension of change, and also how we act. They're all kind of important in terms of moving forward. But ultimately, and this is what Mather tells us, we start with that kind of cognitive dimension. We start to change how we think, before we can actually impact on our belief, on our values. That becomes part of it, but certainly we start from that kind of cognitive dimension. And then ultimately from that, the behavior, how we act can follow. So we need, according to Mezirow, to transform what he calls the frames of reference. And what are the frames of reference? Frames of reference are the structure of meaning, okay? He calls them the structure of our assumption, okay? And when we interpret experience, when we interpret what happens, we make reference to those really to classify the new experience, to classify anything that we encounter in our life. So there are a sort of filter, okay, the frames of reference. And the frames of reference have two elements to it, habit of the mind and point of view. And Mezirow tells us that the habit of the mind is quite ingrained, a habitual way of seeing things. So, and I will give you an example because I think that this might sound a little bit abstract. And these tend to be potentially an obstacle to change because they're so ingrained and often they're not actually something that we are aware of. It's that kind of blind spot that we referred to earlier on. They're that kind of tacit element of our understanding that we haven't already kind of exposed to critical reflection. We haven't actually made it the center of our critical reflection, but remains as an assumption. And then we have points of view that kind of stem from that habit of the mind. And the points of view can change more readily than the habit of the mind. And the fact that we change some point of view doesn't necessarily mean that we actually change the habit of the mind. So I want to give an example here. So imagine that we are looking at how we perceive women from other culture, and roughly that could be conceived as a frame of reference in relation to that particular perception. And Mezirow himself uses the example of ethnocentrism as a habit of the mind. And he would say, well, if we come from an ethnocentric point of view, which essentially means that we consider our culture to be superior and to be the point of reference, then we have a perception of women from other cultures, so not coming from our own culture, which is potentially a negative one. Because if ours is, our culture is a gold standard, anything that is not our culture, we tend to regard it in more negative term or in narrow term, because we might not have that specific knowledge of other cultures. So possible points of view in this case could be, for instance, if we look at women and the perception, women who wear the hijab are oppressed, or that women from Asian background are submissive, and those are all stereotypes. You may obviously start to realize that this is really what it results into. Women in African countries are less respected in society than women in the Western world. All of those are problematic point of view that stem from a problematic habit of the mind, which is often ingrained and tacit, and generally, and this is what Mezirow will tell us, would be a fairly narrow habit of the mind that restricts our perspective and therefore may result in prejudice, may result in jumping to conclusion. And this is really, we're talking about assumptions here, we have to remember. And for that reason, it needs to change, okay? So when we have a frame of reference where the habit of the mind is particularly narrow, that may lead us really to jump to unjustified conclusion that could be problematic in terms of how we relate to others, okay? So what Mezirow tells us is that while we might change some of their point of view, so we might, become friends with someone who wears the hijab, and the person can tell us about the hijab and the significance, the religious significance, but also the sense of protection that for many women, the the hijab offers, or perhaps the sense of identity that the hijab offers. And that might change our perspective. It doesn't mean that we become less ethnocentric, but perhaps in relation to that particular element, we might become a little bit more open. And this openness, development of openness, is an element of transformation. So we recognize through transformative learning that there is something that needs to change. Okay, we reassess. Okay, we try to evaluate what are the grounds for our thinking, and then we modify the structure of our assumption and expectation that frame our tacit point of view and influence our thinking, belief, attitude, and actions. So if you think about that particular example, what is problematic? That ultimately can lead to racism. It can lead to quite damaging practices, or it could lead also to, not engaging with other cultures. So from an intercultural point of view, it's a very damaging kind of frame of reference that needs to be changed, and particularly the underpinning habitat of minds needs to change. So with transformative learning may be defined as a learning that transforms problematic frames of reference to make them more inclusive. So we need to refine our frame of reference. In that particular case, it was very narrow, and inclusive means obviously kind of thinking of more implications of a particular frame of mind. Discriminating in the sense that we are more discerning in terms of the content of our habit of the mind, reflecting, open, and emotionally able to change. So then once we have initiated that process of disruption of the problematic frame of reference, then it follows a more kind of a emotional kind of response to it and the ability to move forward. So I suppose I'm not sure how we're doing. We're a little bit behind with time, but I would like perhaps to stop here before we enter the discussion of second chance education.
Yeah, Francesca, that's great, and thanks for the fascinating input so far. So we are slightly behind time, so we might just take a shorter break of just 5 minutes now for people to stretch their legs, and if we come back at around 12 minutes past 11 to be precise, just a break of 5 minutes, and we'll continue with the second part of the session, if that's okay with you, Francesca.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. So if we all come back at 12 minutes past 11, so just 5 minutes to stretch the legs and grab a cup of tea.
Okay. At the beginning of this session, I just mentioned that I wanted to relate the presentation and discussion of transformative learning to second chance education. I'm not being terribly original here, Mather himself did it, but just really on the term second chance, really, as I mentioned before, it's just really kind of a terminology that is used in official sources. UNESCO here is one example of that, but ultimately what is important is really that we focus our attention on those who in some way are undergoing or might have undergone a transformation. And when we think in terms of second chance, there is some kind of something jarring, something that needs to change, something that it becomes modified, whether that is through personal choice or perhaps because the circumstances change. Ultimately, we know that there is something that needs in some way to be transformed. I remember teaching, I also teach on the PME post-primary, and I remember during the recession, there was a number of those working in the building industry that actually decided really to change career and to become teachers, because obviously the work had dried up. So there was a number of architects, for instance, becoming maths teachers, and the circumstances that dictated that particular change and moving on to something different, and then having to reacquire new qualification. And at the same time, if I remember in the Centre for the Unemployed, when I was working back in Cork, there was people who never really had the chance. So was that a second or a first chance? But I remember kind of the eagerness in terms of wanting to do something with their life that would enable them really to move forward. Now, my computer has decided to freeze. Okay, no, that's fine. So if we think in terms of Mezirow, okay, his own reflection on second chance education comes from the very beginning of his own thinking, really, in 1978, when he wrote the article on perspective transformation. It was stemming from a 1975 study on women returning to post-secondary education, and those who had really participated in this particular process, according to Mezirow, had undergone personal transformation. And the particular kind of research had evidence that when the condition that prevent individuals from engaging in education are kind of removed, there is a genuine opportunity for change and transformation. So we need to foster, build the condition for accessing education and ultimately accessing transformation, okay? And this was one of the fundamental elements that, according to Mezirow, emerged from this study, that those who had engaged in education had raised their consciousness, have become more self-aware, their strengths and their weaknesses, and gained confidence as part of that. And as a result, they were able to re-enter society with a completely different perspective. And we know that that is really important for adult learners, really that kind of a coming with their experience, bringing their experience to the learning process and having experience of knowledge. And we're talking about experience as being a fundamental element in terms of perspective change and transformation. We bring those experiences, but those experiences could actually cause a barrier for us because those experiences may not necessarily be positive. And as a result, when adult learners bring those experiences to the new learning experience, those could act as barriers. And in terms of frames of references, they could potentially represent a problematic frame of reference. But ultimately, as adult educators, we need to be aware of that. We need to deconstruct some of those experiences. We need to deconstruct the meaning attached to those experiences and actually moving a learner forward. So trying to kind of capture this idea of a frame of reference that is relating really to the experience of second chance learners. So the habit of the mind often could be that any form of education is likely to be a negative experience because that's what has been happening before. Some might have dropped from formal education. Some have found formal education particularly challenged. Some might have felt that formal education wasn't really meeting their own particular needs. And the resulting point of view can be easily predicted here, a reinforced sense of inadequacy, structured learning environment become regarded as something that doesn't fit the individual. And then the teachers and tutors are individuals that don't actually relate to me as an individual who failed the system or was failed by the system, the educational system. So in order to change that habit of the mind of looking at education as something negative, we need really to work with the learner in terms of building their confidence and providing them with experiences that sort of kind of disrupt the previous experience, make the learner reconsider previous learning experience, but also offer an alternative to previous learning experiences that actually kind of broaden that frame of reference that all education then has to be regarded as a negative experience. So, and as adult educators or community educators, we need to embrace transformative learning as a form of teaching for change. When we say teaching for change, it is a modification that goes beyond the superficial dimension. Yes, it needs to have that kind of outward kind of dimension that can be seen from the outside, but ultimately, as some of you have said in the breakout room, it starts from that kind of inner dimension of ourselves, where we start to look inward at how we think, and we start really to identify our own blind spots, because we're helped by the educators to do that. So transformative learning has two dimensions, really. We said, that, well, a core dimension is the communicative dimension, which is aimed at sharing meaning and at building communities among those who engage in the process of transformation. As adult educators, we might have also some kind of dimension of functional, instrumental learning that needs to happen. And, Habermas was very critical of this, because he would argue that it's a means to efficiency, any type of action that has that kind of instrumental dimension. And if we think of all the language that is so prominent now in terms of learning outcome and teaching based on learning outcome, we have almost a sense of education as really a product, and a product that needs to be achieved. And this is very much kind of really kind of stemming from a neoliberal conception of education, as segmented, fragmented, only based on skills, and not really addressing a broader development, which I think it's more the core of what transformative learning is. But ultimately, as adult educators that work with transformative learning, we need to reconcile the two. So while we can't neglect the functional instrumental dimension, we also need to cultivate that transformative dimension that kind of looks at the inner change and development of the individual, and particularly the development of the thinking of the individual. And so in terms of our task, we need to build an atmosphere, a climate in the classroom that enables us to help the students, the learners, to open up. Okay, so there needs to be an atmosphere of openness. If you remember, we're talking about dialogue, and we're talking about difference. Another element of dialogue is a suspension of judgment, where in order to enter in dialogue with others, we refrain from judging. So there is that openness to start with, which is an openness to the views of others, which may influence us as well. So if we allow that to happen, that is actually something that is likely to help us to modify our own perspective and broaden our meaning perspectives. And we need to provide support, because obviously that could be a painful process. And this is one thing that actually, it was interesting to hear from the breakout room, that kind of discomfort that comes from having to give up something that was ingrained in our own way of thinking. And what we need to feel that it's safe to do so. We need to feel that there is an atmosphere of trust, where if I express a point of view that might be problematic, I'm not going to be shut down, but I'm helped to see what might be problematic about that particular point of view. And so there needs to be that kind of balance between support and challenge, because if we don't challenge our learners to think differently, then the transformation is unlikely to happen spontaneously. And then, of course, we have to, the balance is so delicate that if we push too hard, the student will resist. And resistance, again, it's a possible outcome of us having this kind of educational intent to bring about transformation, but then kind of not really kind of thinking in terms of who the learners are and what stage of transformation they're at. And that will be another element that we look at in a moment, where we look at the different phases of transformation. But if we push too little, the change doesn't happen. We said, well, maybe there might be a change in terms of points of view, but will the habit of the mind be affected to the point that whole meaning reference is actually transformed? And this is really what we aim to achieve ultimately. And transformation, and in general, any kind of change, is not a linear process. And this is why we need to be careful to see where our learners are in terms of kind of moving forward. And there might be points where we start, and sometimes really when we start a new experience, my experience also working with mature students is that there is such a trepidation to start with. And then there's the sheer joy in being able to, have a new opportunity, explore something new, learn something new, and a genuine, if you like, wanting and motivation very, very strong to be there. And but at the same time, the phases, can change. I find normally around the time of assessment, the students start to have all sorts of anxiety. They say the pressure mounts on, and then all sorts of kind of difficulties that, because of the personal investment that comes with engaging in a learning process. Sometimes it can, go both ways, either kind of finding a way out of it, or else kind of just literally sinking. And this is really where we don't want that to happen. So in order for transformation to happen, it needs to be supported, but it needs to be supported in such a way that it enables the learners to develop their own autonomous thinking. Remember, autonomy being another key element of transformation as an outcome of transformation. So we need to help our learners to manage change rather than just simply responding to it. So that kind of proactive mind that whereby we start really to help them to see the blind spot and to start to think of how those blind spots could potentially be addressed. And this really needs to come from the learner, really, where they start to become resourceful and resilient. And transformation requires a lot of resourcefulness and a lot of resilience. And eventually, we withdraw some of the support and we enhance the ability of the learners to become autonomous. So continuous self-development is dependent on the ability to reflect and capitalize on experience. And we need to help the students, the learner, to build that kind of reflective habit. So that is not something prompted by us, but it's something that becomes central to facing new experiences and looking back at old experiences. Mesereau talks about 10 particular phases in terms of transformative learning. On my screen, I don't see, there is actually one thing that is actually, I managed to remove it. There was blocking my view. But there are 10 different phases. And before we take action, we go through particular phases that kind of really make us question what's happening. And sometimes, and this needs to be said, learners come to return to education having already experienced a disorienting dilemma and have already engaged in some element of self-examination that has led them really to return to education. In other cases, they might be prompted to engage in a training course. It could be in a community education course, in a course which may not necessarily have been by choice, but ultimately if you like, the influence of this particular course of study will depend on the extent to which this results on really kind of re-examining one's own thinking. So this is really what Mesereau tells us, that, if there is a disorienting dilemma, something that kind of makes us question what we're doing, what way am I going? There are multiple possible directions, but one of the directions that perhaps could be a valuable one is to re-engage in learning, okay? And once we move forward in terms of critical examination of the assumption, and we started really with a disorienting dilemma, generally, there is some element of self-examination already happening. It's the critical examination of assumption that needs to happen through the educational process. So once this happens, then we possibly have identified a blind spot. And that kind of disorientation that we experienced at the beginning is because we knew something wasn't right, but we didn't know what wasn't right. And then now that we are becoming more self-aware, we've been helped to become more self-aware. We engage in this process of transformation. And from there on, really, we are starting to plan action and then eventually taking action, and then could lead to all sorts of kind of acquisition, new skills, implementing one's plan, try new roles, and very much building competence. But ultimately, what needs to happen, and this is also equally fundamental, is that process of reintegration in one's life on the basis of the condition dictated by one new perspective. So it doesn't mean that we're completely different human beings. We're still the same human being, but with a different perspective. And because we said that could be the acquisition of a new perspective, could be a painful process. It could be create a lot of discomfort. We need to reconcile what has emerged from this process of discomfort with the new acquired identity as a new human, with different perspective. And I don't know, many of you might have seen the film Educating Rita. I'm sure that has been used in so many adult education programs, it has been used in many qualifications, but the point to be made is relevant to this. In this case, Rita, if you've seen the film, adult, Open University student, and she returns to education, having been a hairdresser, a good hairdresser, and but she feels that something is not quite right in her life and she needs some kind of stimulation. And we can see from this example that she has already started she has already encountered that kind of disorienting dilemma. She has already kind of started some kind of process of reflection, and we see in her encounter with the professor that she's already someone who has quite a critical ability. She notices things on the wall. She notices, she's already reading. She's already looking outside the window and being able to notice things. So there is that kind of reflective capacity that is already quite a characteristic of her as a student, as a potential student. And the engagement, the dialogical engagement with the professor is really what brings out further awareness. And this is really what is relevant here. And then, of course, at the end of the film, without spoiling it too much for you, if you haven't seen it, Rita is finding herself a bit out of place, okay? And there is that kind of need for reintegration that needs to happen as the part of the transformation to take away a little bit of that discomfort. And the discomfort is not felt when, the new perspective becomes part of who we are and what we think. So here I'm quoting really from an experience of an adult education student. Returning to school in my 50s was transformative, partly because I was able to broaden my understanding of what I'd experienced in my life by seeing it from the perspective of various academic disciplines and by reflecting on it at length in writing. Even more important was approaching these studies as an opportunity for self-integration, with a desire to become more balanced and authentic in my interaction with the diverse other people who were part of my life. And here, self-integration and revisiting experience. I always say to our students in college, for instance, some of them are parents, some will be mature students, they might have raised kids without knowing the theory of developmental psychology in relation to how to raise kids. And then when they actually think back about instances that have happened in their parenting experience, they're able to revisit those in a new light, precisely because now they've acquired this kind of framework that allows them to rethink, revisit, and consider those experiences in a new life. So self-integration, very important after a kind of disruption to the way we think. Mesero himself didn't really kind of focus too much on the if you like, on the practice of transformative learning, okay, except perhaps a little bit more later in his publication. Many other authors really have tried to extract from his theoretical framework some insight that might actually lead to identification of potential kind of strategies that could be applied in the classroom. And these are some that have been associated, but ultimately, if you think about it, really, they're all kind of strategies, processes that kind of in broad terms can be associated with adult education in general terms. So the idea of, empowering learners through learning content that kind of actively engage the learning in thinking about their own interests, their own needs, dialogical classroom interaction. Again, we mentioned this as being fundamental for transformative learning because we're exposed to different perspectives that might influence our own perspective and might create also mutual understanding. Again, group and project work, they activate learners, but they also, in terms of group work, kind of lead us really to engage with the view of others for the group work to work. And in my experience, group work is not always well received by our mature students in at third level, because there isn't that necessarily that kind of there is often kind of very ingrained way of thinking. There might be challenged during group work and there'll be other kind of difficulties, but often that seems to be the case, kind of different perspective, different values that come and clash in group work. And then, that kind of case-based analysis brings kind of the experiential elements to it, where we're looking at specific context experiences, and the reflection of those contexts really may kind of make us go back to our own experience and rethink some elements of it. And then role plays where, again, there is active participation, and by engaging in role play, again, that process of reflection might be activated. And, toolkits, in the sense that there isn't really that kind of a readily kind of devised, methodology attached to the theory of measure. But of course, we can think that because it's a framework, because it's a theory, the purpose was for individuals, really, for educators, really, to translate that into their specific context, and just really to use the framework as something that informs the way they conceive the educational experience they want to generate for their students. And finally, then, more specific points about disorienting dilemma that, according to Roberts, they could be part of the educational experience. It could be something that we foster ourselves if we encounter learners that they haven't actually already initiated that process of self-questioning. But if that is part of what we do, if we adopt, let's say, disruptive pedagogy or a discomfort pedagogy, which is often used when trying to kind of make others see things from a different perspective, there might be, quite an emotional response that could elicit kind of very negative feelings. So that kind of push and pull that we discussed earlier on could be something that needs to be considered carefully, and educators themselves need to consider the extent to which they're able to foster a transformative experience without having necessarily been exposed themselves. And of course, it requires resilience and specific skills in order to achieve this, and not everybody, in working in this particular field does have it. So to conclude, just that transformation cannot be assumed as a result of education. We saw education can generate quite negative experiences that could actually act as a barrier to further education or to returning to education. And one of the participants made the point that, why focusing on second chance education? Why not focusing on lifelong learning? And lifelong learning presumes that kind of ability to return to education at any point and engage in education along the life spectrum. And certainly, transformative learning can be something we engage in at any point in life. It is not necessarily something linked to age or specific experience. And certainly something that doesn't limit that. But ultimately, education doesn't necessarily result per se in transformation. As we said, the transformative learning is a critical lens of it's a framework, and for that reason, accusation of reductivism and very much of kind of focusing only on thinking or not focusing on intersubjectivity potentially are elements that kind of constitute a strength of the framework precisely because it allows for greater adaptability and transferability to many educational contexts. And ultimately, the lack of prescriptiveness in terms of how it's done, what are the methodology, what are the tools, again, it's something that allows the educator really to take what they want out of the general idea and then to adapt it to their own learners, their own context, their own teaching style, and making really something that they can work with themselves.